My name is Brian McClellan. I write Flintlock epic fantasy novels. I'm known for the Powder Mage series. And I've also got a brand new self-published urban fantasy coming out in April about the collection agency that works for Hell.
My name is Dan Wells. I write a lot of different stuff, horror and science fiction primarily. I wrote the John Cleaver series, which has a movie called I Am Not a Serial Killer. Science fiction includes Partials and the Mirador cyberpunk series. And the latest book is called Zero G. It's Home Alone in Space. It is on Audible, and it's amazing, and you should all go read it right now. Or listen to it, I guess, since it's on Audible. If you can read it, then I'm impressed.
My name's Howard Tayler. I write and illustrate Schlock Mercenary. I do writing excuses with Dan, 15 minutes long because you're in a hurry and we're not that smart. I would just like to say, Natasha, I know everybody up here. You are the most important person in the room right now because, oh my.
My name is Erin Johnston. I write science fiction primarily with Orson Scott Card. We're currently writing the Ender's Game prequel series. I also co-created and wrote a sci-fi show called Extinct, which Dan helped with. And currently, I am the assistant managing editor of the Ensign magazine. So that's a non sequitur. If you are interested in writing for the Ensign magazine, talk to me afterward.
Pass this all over. It's gonna be fun. Okay, so let's start this off. What are types of ensemble casts? Because when I got this, I was like, oh my goodness, like we can go ensemble cast in so many different directions, like ensemble cast like Lord of the Rings, and then ensemble cast like Winesburg, Ohio. So can we define that a little bit?
I think each of us is actually going to define it a little different based on our speciality. So I do epic fantasy, and my books are pretty much all 3 to 4 points of view that kind of all intertwine in different ways over the course of a book, and then tons of side characters. And so, yeah, I tend to be very heavy on the lots of different characters and jumping around between people's heads part. And so, yeah, that's kind of where I come into this.
For me, ensemble cast just means there's a bunch of people who have to interact with each other, and that can serve different purposes. There is what I call like the Michael Crichton super person, which is what you see in heist movies or Leverage, that kind of thing. That's what I used in Blue Screen. Here are a bunch of different people who are all very good at one thing, and together they fight crime, or whatever it is. On the other hand, something like Partials, I used a big ensemble cast purely because I needed a lot of different perspectives on the same issue, and I needed a lot of different attitudes so that people could disagree with each other and I could show different sides of the same, not coin, because there were like 12 of them, different sides of the same 12-sided die. And so ensemble casts can serve a lot of different purposes depending on what you're trying to do.
If I had to categorize them, I'd pick 2. One is the ensemble cast, like the heist movie, where we are turning pages, we are stuck in our seats because of the relationships between these people and seeing them take turns be awesome. And the second is the epic fantasy ensemble cast, where if I only follow one character, the world doesn't feel big. I have to have enough people for the world to feel big. I don't want them to feel like cardboard cutout side characters, but we're not turning pages the way we would in a heist. We're turning pages because it's a big story and we want to see what happens. So for me, that's where I'd draw the line, but it's a really fuzzy line.
Here comes the second microphone. Applause for the second microphone guy. Sorry. I'm the only one that's thrilled by that. As far as ensemble cast, I guess we're categorizing it. So for the Ender's Game prequel novels, we just have 6 or 7 point of view characters in the novel. I guess my approach is a space opera approach. Also, as a writer of television, I also take a different approach for an ensemble cast because there are actual living human beings who represent those characters and who expect to be in each episode and who expect to have business and story. And so that's a different commitment that a writer must make in television.
Hello. Okay, so let's get into some craft questions then based on that. Clearly you have a lot of characters that you're balancing, so how do you deal with group dynamic and bringing out each of those characters?
I pick the one who is most likely to be able to give me a good punchline first. And it is entirely possible that that's the wrong choice when I'm doing a POV switch. It's super awesome for me if the story naturally flows from character to character, event to event, plot point to plot point, punchline to punchline, without me having to make any compromises. That happens about 1 week in 53. So, but that's where I start.
I like to see, because I have 3 or 4 point of view characters in a big, like 200,000 word book. I tend to balance them really evenly in terms of screen time, except I always have one that in my head, they are the main point of view characters. And so I try to always connect the other characters, even tangentially, to that one middle person and kind of have them revolving in a certain way, so that we can kind of see the eye of the hurricane, and you get a feeling that there is a main story rather than 3 or 4 separate stories. And that may not be done very strongly, or it may be literally one of the other characters works for them or something like that. And it can go either way for me.
So for the novels I do with Scott Card, we have about 6 point of view characters, and each point of view character gets a chapter. Okay, so and rarely do we go back to a character before all 6 of those have had a chapter represented. George Martin does the same thing and does it a lot better. In television, it's every principal actor has to be present and have business and story in each of the 5 acts. So structurally, for television, it's a little more demanding.
You know, in hindsight, it's so obvious, but I was shocked at how different writing for TV was. Like, I remember sitting in a writer's room meeting with Erin, and we came up with some great idea, and we're like, okay, and we're going to add this new character. And he's like, we don't have enough money to pay another character. And I've never run into that in books. I have all the imaginary brain points I need to just pay whatever new imaginary person. But no, when it's actual actors that you have to pay them money to be there, we can't afford to get a new person, and people like the villain too much, so we can't kill him and get a new one, and all these things. I'm like, no, that's not how it's supposed to work. But it was still really fun and cool to do. I don't have a good answer to this question. I don't know. When I'm writing a bunch of different people, I try to make sure that they are recognizably different from each other, you know? If I get to the point where my editor comes back and says, everyone in this conversation sounds like the same person, or worse yet, everyone in this conversation sounds like you, then I've done it wrong. There are scenes in some of my books where I could go through and strip out all the dialogue tags and I would still know who is speaking, even if there's 5 or 6. I love huge conversations. It is one of my very favorite things to write, whether that is, you know, the 5 people on the sports team or the 7 people in the boardroom in Extreme Makeover. I love writing those conversations, and it's because I get to drill down into the nuances of this person is going to crack a joke just like this person, but it's going to sound different because they're different people. They're funny in different ways.
I actually like to aid myself in that way of trying to make them all sound different by making their goals all very different, their outlooks on life all very different. In my second Powder Mage trilogy, I have one character who is a female general. I have another character who is a ex-convict war hero, just a murder machine. And I have another character that's a spy. And the 3 things are very different on purpose. because that helps me make the reader be able to tell the difference between them all in the narrative, if we had removed all dialogue tags and things like that. It just makes it's a tool to, aid me in that sort of thing.
How do you know when to scrap an ensemble cast and par down?
Well, if you scrap your ensemble cast, you don't have a cast, and so you don't have a story. But I have, and probably many people here have had this experience where I'm 60,000 words into a novel, and I discover this is losing interest. I'm not invested. I don't care. I don't mean to criticize, as an example, I don't mean to criticize, but I recently watched a science fiction show. At the end of the pilot, one of the characters dies, and I won't say what the pilot was, but I didn't care. I wasn't invested at all in the relationship that this mortally wounded character had with another character on the show, and so I think the instant I start to feel deeply invested in the character, even if they're a scoundrel, and I don't care what happens to them, then something's wrong.
I tend to not trim characters. I tend to, if I feel like they're not working, instead of trimming them, because I do like having multiple points of view, like Dan said, so that I can see things from lots of different directions. Instead of trimming them, I'll tend to just work on that character until they fit into the world and the narrative I'm creating.
Okay, when she asked this question, I immediately said, I don't think I've ever done that, but I have. I totally have. The 5th John Cleaver book, basically the entire book is that. I've built up a big ensemble cast and reset it a couple of times and done all this. And for book 5, I trimmed it right down so it's just 2 people. It's John and his friend. And yes, there are other people in the book, but the focus, and why did I do it? Specifically because I wanted to focus on that relationship. It had become the defining point of the series for me, and I wanted to make sure I could handle it correctly, which meant that I needed to be able to do conversations without 5 other people butting in and trying to crack their jokes all the time, which is what usually happens when I write a book. And so this one, I'm like, nope, there's 2 characters plus their dog. Let's go. That is a spoiler.
On the subject of spoilers, you also pruned the cast way back in the 4th book.
Yeah. And Howard hasn't forgiven me for that.
I liked all of those people. For my own part, I have too many characters in Schlock Mercenary. There's hundreds of named characters, many of whom have had multiple panels in which their point of view is important, and keeping track of that is an absolute nightmare. The way for me to pair, I can't go back and edit because it's published. That's one of the perils of my form, the medium I'm working in. The wrong thing to do is for me to weed the cast out by just killing people, because me as a writer, if I kill a character because I don't care about them anymore, odds are pretty good you don't care about them anymore either, and this is meaningless. It was just wasting page space. For me, the solution is often to give a character their triumphant character arc moment mid-book, and then we can pan away from them because they've accomplished the thing they set out to accomplish, and now everything else that they do is just noises off stage. We may peek in from time to time and see, yep, still alive, still building whatevers, but I don't need to have more scenes with them because I've satisfied the reader that character has had an arrival point in this story.
One thing I think it's interesting about all of us is not only do we work with ensemble casts, but they're ensemble cast in long, ongoing series, right? And so I think that makes it particularly challenging because the characters have to have longevity, right, as an ensemble. And I think I mentioned George Martin a moment ago, so now he's on my brain. I think this is one of the brilliant aspects of Game of Thrones, right? In that the characters continue to reinvent themselves, right? Not only in a way that redeems them often, but also but opens doors to possibilities. Like I think about Jaime Lannister, who I think is one, at least at the outset of the series, is one of the most despicable characters I've ever read, and who has transformed himself, spoiler alert, throughout the series, and is all the more complex and all the more interesting. And I think you can say the same thing for pretty much every character on Game of Thrones that at least is still alive. I think each of us, that's probably something that we're mindful of as well, is this is, not only do we have to be mindful of the ensemble cast in this novel, but we have to think down the road, okay, how do we preserve the ensemble in book 4, in book 5, and book 6?
So I guess speaking to that, then how do you also manage the dynamic within your ensembles to kind of make sure that there's not so much infighting or talking over each other, that you can still get the storyline to function?
I love this question because one of the reasons that I love writing big conversations with a bunch of different characters is because of the way they're always talking over each other. And I love that sense of, I am trying to get this story done in spite of the characters rather than because of them. You know, that they have their own lives, and yes, they're at present involved in this story, but it's not the only story they're ever going to be a part of, and they've got other things going on. But yes, even at that, you have to at some point pare down. And so usually I will have, one character who is deeply emotionally invested in solving the problem, and another character who is deeply emotionally invested in solving it for a totally different reason, which still lets them argue and which still lets them talk, but it helps corral everybody else, so that we're all, at the end of the scene, yes, we've managed to come up with a plan in spite of all the crosstalk.
Characters talking over each other, interrupting each other, it's such a useful tool, it's almost a crutch in terms of building a punchline. A punchline is supposed to function in many ways as, surprising yet inevitable. And if one character is on a train of thought that will, in 4 or 5 sentences, lead us to a conclusion that's kind of humorous, that's fine. If 3 or 4 sentences before they get there, they are interrupted by somebody who delivers that conclusion in a pithier way than the first character would have, then I have dynamic dialogue that is more fun to read and that functions as a comic strip. This is not a great technique to apply every 4-panel style in prose, because it quickly becomes unreadable. But if your characters would talk over each other, let them.
I think about the movie Goonies. When Dan was describing talking over each other, you think about that ensemble cast in Goonies. And if you haven't seen that, what's wrong with you? What's great about Goonies is each member of this cast is distinct. I mean, if they were all the same, if they were like the members of a t-ball team, and they all had the same personalities, and they all went into the cave and had the same perspectives, we wouldn't be talking about Goonies, right? Because it'd be worthless. So yeah, I think if you're going to have an ensemble cast, particularly if they're collected together and they're working as a team, that is the essence of team dynamic. That you have all of them being pulled in many different macro directions, even though they're all moving in the same. They're moving in many micro directions, but they're all moving in the same macro direction.
Jumping between people's heads, but having very definite points of view in each scene, I think that helps things keep it straight. Because if I'm inside one character's head and they're having an argument with the other character, the reader knows where the other character is coming from, but they're going to be empathizing with the character whose head they're inside. And that's it helps gives you a very definite cohesion to characters talking over each other and, big confrontation scenes between different characters. Honestly, I look at something like Dune, and I have no idea how he made it work, like head jumping inside of a scene. Like, that sounds like the biggest headache to me as a writer. And it's well done, but I wouldn't suggest it because of that.
So based on that, can you talk a little bit more about technique and how to do that? Because you just said headspace, but then we talk about like dialogue, which to me, right, you can write from like an omniscient point of view, and then you can write from a point of view in a character's head. So let's.
So specific technique, one of my favorites, and I've asked this question of Dan and Brandon years and years and years ago, and Dan's answer was, "Oh, it's just a cheap trick. It doesn't have a name." And it's what I've come to call the common tone modulation, is when a chapter ends and characters have been talking and one of the words that they use appears early in the first paragraph of the next chapter, but in a completely different context. What we are doing is modulating between points of view with a word that lets the reader know we have changed points of view because this word is being used in a different way. I just scripted a strip. It's actually illustrated and hopefully colored by now. I should go check on that, or I'll miss a day, and that would be a disaster. In which the last line, one of the characters is saying, "Well, that explains your IT budget," and the strip that follows that, scene change, and the first line, which is not a punchline, is, "Do I have an Intel budget?" We are having a conversation not really about budget, but I'm modulating on that in order to thread the reader between across the lines. Now, when Dan said 10 years ago, "Oh, that's just a cheap trick," if you use it too much, then the reader does not see that as a thread that draws them. They see that as they're being railroaded, and they really didn't want to be in this new chapter. The word budget alone is not going to cut it. And so it's something to be used judiciously. Yeah.
So as far as technique for us in our Ender's Game prequel novels, the technique is third-person limited point of view, which means that we're writing in third person. We're writing in from the perspective of a specific character. And when we go inside that character's head, that character can't know anything that hasn't been conveyed to them, right? So it's not omniscient in which the narrator knows all, but it has to be from the perspective viewpoint of the character. That's challenging when there are multiple point of view characters, because if you, for example, if the reader knows something because they've been in the mind of a previous character, they've been through their point of view, you don't want to have a scene wherein that same information is conveyed to another character because the reader already knows it, and suddenly you're being redundant and uninteresting. So as a writer, you have to be mindful of who knows what, right, and how they receive that information, and you have to convey that in a way that that you don't lose the reader's interest.
Do I have to answer now? I don't know. She asks hard questions. You just write books.
Most important person in the room.
First of all, when I am writing one of these big, lots of people talking scenes, big ensemble cast is trying to accomplish something, I make sure that there is business going on, right? Even when I did the boardroom scenes in Makeover, which is really just 6 or 7 people sitting around a conference table, there's still something that they're trying to do. They're trying to present their new ideas for marketing, or they're trying to get a report from the financial person, or they're trying to get a report from the science person. There is something going on. There is background business. There is something to do with your hands while you're talking. And what that does is it gives some interest to the scene so that it's not just talking heads, it's talking bodies. And also it gives it energy. Yes, the outline says that what has to happen in this scene is that they have to argue and then come to this conclusion. And I need them to get to that conclusion because that's what will drive them to the next scene. But that's not why the characters are there. That's why I put them there. But from their own perspective, they're there because they need to talk about the marketing report or whatever. They're real people and they have a thing going on. And so making sure that there's always energy, that there's visual components rather than just verbal components, that there is more than one thing driving it, and that it is the characters driving it and not the outline. That is so vital.
For me, it goes back to what we had been talking about before, which was having very distinct characters, distinct voices. When I approach these big, fat, epic fantasies, if I'm thinking I'm going to end up around 180,000 words, I actually think of that as 3 different 60,000-word books that are intertwined closely. And that kind of, it helps me keep my eye on the target for each different character, because, and it makes it very distinct for the reader, because they know that every character in that boardroom that are arguing about something, they all have different reasons for being there. They all want to get different things out of this. And it's very clear from the beginning rather than something I have to get across in the scene.
I'd also add, in terms of technique, which was your question. So going back to writing in third-person limited point of view, if you're writing from the perspective of multiple different characters, I don't know if this has ever been done, but I'd say it's a really, really bad idea to write from the perspective of many characters if you're writing in first person, because it'd be very difficult to manage that. That said, Robert Crais, who's an author who I love, he sometimes, and when I discovered he was doing this in the novel, I almost gave up because I didn't believe it could be done. But he has a recurring detective character, Elvis Cole, that he has in all of his novels. When he started to go to an ensemble cast from the perspective of multiple point of view characters, the Elvis Cole chapters are in first person. All the other chapters are in third person. I would never do that myself because I don't know that I could pull it off. But he certainly did pull it off. I would also say, at least this is from my own experience, the more point of view characters you have, if your ensemble cast, if each of them are a point of view character, the more point of view characters you have, the more difficult of an assignment you're giving yourself, because it can easily become unwieldy. Like I think of, again, I have Game of Thrones on my brain. So Orson Scott Card and I talk about Game of Thrones. He's a big fan of Game of Thrones, but he's a bigger fan of Tyrion Lannister. So when he reads Game of Thrones, he reads all of the Tyrion chapters, and then he goes back and reads the other chapters. So, and that's a danger. The danger when you have multiple point of view characters is that one of them can be remarkably more interesting than the others. If you have multiple point of view characters, you want to ensure that all of them are interesting.
Okay, I will now open it up for questions. Yes.
So, when it comes to creating multiple ensembles across various different genres or stories, how do you avoid copying and pasting? Like, how do you avoid taking a character trait, giving it to someone else so that they're almost practically the same character? How do you switch that up?
John Rogers, Dean Devlin, the guys who created Leverage, which is a small ensemble heist, also created a show called The Librarians, which is urban fantasy heist. And sometimes they nail it. These characters are different. The roles from Leverage are not mapping onto the roles in the Librarians. And sometimes I can tell that a junior writer took over this episode and didn't have as firm a grip on how they were different. I don't know what their methodology is, but I enjoy both shows, and by watching it, I know it can be done well, and I know it can break.
I have done this before. If you've read the Dan Wells, whatever, Marcus in Partials is kind of sort of basically Val in Blue Screen, and I didn't realize that until I was writing a new one that I haven't sold anywhere yet. And realized, I've got this same dude again. This like little sidekick wisecrack boy who his job is just to be the kind of asexual best friend who makes jokes all the time. Like, that's what he is. And the problem arose when I realized that I had settled into the rut. Marcus and Val, while still filling that role, are unique individuals. And by the time I got to the third one, I was just kind of going through the motions with it. And I had to stop and go, wait, back to what Brian has been talking about. He doesn't have a personality. He has what looks like a personality when viewed from a distance. I need to give him things that he likes, and I need to make sure that he's a real person, that I know who he is, and that there is more depth to his character than I need another asexual wisecracking boy. So yes, making sure that they are real people, kind of just by definition, as a side effect, is going to make sure that they aren't the same as each other.
I would just add, I think a key to this is for you as a writer to have a great deal of empathy and compassion for people, right? And the reason why I say that is because...
That's what I'm doing wrong.
The reason why I say that is because as a writer, you have to be able to manage the perspectives and philosophies and life circumstances of a lot of different people, and they have to be honorable to you, right? And you have to have a great deal of respect for how other people think and how they approach life and what they value. And if, so often I read a story and I say, oh, this character is the author, right? This hero is the author. Or I'll see a play and I'm like, oh, the author must be an angry white man because I see that character in the play, right? And so I think as writers, we have to be careful about projecting our whole selves into our writing, and rather project fragments of ourselves into all the characters that exist, and be mindful of and compassionate and empathetic towards everybody around you.
Back there, gray sweater armor.
Okay, so in films like Ocean's 11 and Avengers, they can assemble their cast really effectively. How do you do that in a book where you can't do it visually?
You're asking hard questions too.
Well, it's not always necessary. It's not always necessary to assemble your characters. I mean, it can be, but like in a space opera, it's very, very difficult to assemble your cast, because they're spread out over the solar system, and it takes 6 months for them to have a meet and greet, and that's just not in the cards. So you don't always have to assemble your point of view characters in an ensemble cast.
But if you're building a team, I guess is what I mean.
If you're building a team, yeah. So I don't have an answer for that.
You mentioned movies and said, they can do it. How do you do that? How do you do that in books? It's worth pointing out that it was not easy for them to do it in the movies. The Avengers, it took 5 films for them to build that team. Guardians of the Galaxy pulled it off in 20 minutes. And I love deconstructing that. When we first meet Rocket and Groot, we meet them in circumstances where there are no other short furry people and there are no other tree people. They are completely unique and they stand out, and we are immediately drawn to them. When we meet Gamora, the whole scene is painted in colors in shades of black and blue, and she's the only thing there that's green. When you see her in a forest scene, and she just looks green and maybe a little weird. You see her in that scene, and even though she's talking like a bad guy, your brain tells her she's the only person here I really want to like. Those sorts of techniques translate really well into prose because you can use words to set apart characters when we meet them. You can give them pithy lines of dialogue, and I'm not talking about punchlines necessarily, just snappy bits of dialogue that very quickly express an opinion that you have primed the reader to agree with, and now we know that person's a member of the team and we're on board.
One of the ways that I do this, I learned from GMing role-playing games with my friends all the time, which is, if you get them together and they all create their characters separately, then they're all individuals and they're all different people and they all have different goals, and it is going to be herding cats to get them to try to kill the same necromancer or whatever. And so the way to get around that is you have one or two of them already be friends or relatives or something. They already know each other. Part of your team is already there. Rocket and Groot are already buddies. The other way is that you force them together by circumstance while also investing them in the same goal. Even if they're invested for different reasons, and Guardians of the Galaxy does this really well as well. They are all there to capture something, each other or an artifact or whatever. They all get thrown into prison. They have to work together to get out. They have that same investment. And in the process of that, where you have forced them to work together, then they eventually come up with a much broader goal and they can go on and they can kill the necromancer. But those are the cheap and dirty tricks that I learned in role-playing that translate way too well to writing.
Yeah, the short answer is they have to have a shared objective.
Yes, you.
So you talked a lot about with all these different characters, normally it's different third-person perspectives. Can you have an epic series, whether it's sci-fi or fantasy, that is very long but still only covers one viewpoint character, like while having many other characters that interact with them but still maintaining one perspective throughout?
Yeah, you can do it. I think about the longest that I can think of off the top of my head, the longest epic fantasy that I've seen that's only one POV is about 120,000 words, which is actually pretty short for an epic fantasy. But it can be done, but you're going to be on the shorter end, I think, because we've been talking about the feel of needing like an ensemble cast to feel epic sometimes, and I think that if you try to push that too much with a single point of view, that you're going to want the rest that takes place between books. You're going to maybe separate that out a little bit more.
The word epic itself implies that it is a larger story than just one person. So depending on genre, the short answer, the first answer is anything you can pull off works because you've pulled it off. So go ahead and go for it. But I would worry about it for that reason.